People usually crossed the street when they saw Clifford Morrison coming. They pretended to check their phones, ducked into stores, found sudden interest in window displays. Fear had trained them well. The little girl didn't move. She stood there, even as his shadow stretched over her, even as the air around him thickened with the silent warning that followed him everywhere. Her knees trembled, but her feet stayed planted on the concrete. When a car backfired down the block, she flinched hard, then forced herself to look back up at him. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from by sharing your location in the comments. We truly appreciate your support. Clifford noticed everything: the way her fingers twisted the hem of her shirt, the shallow breaths she took between words she hadn't yet said. Courage, he realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing still while your body begged you to run. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sonia," she replied. Her voice was small, but she answered without hesitation, as if she'd practiced this moment over and over in her head. His men remained a few steps behind him, tense and watchful. Ethan's eyes swept the street, already calculating threats. Victor stood still, expression unreadable, waiting for instruction. This was not how their nights were supposed to begin. "How old are you, Sonia?" 7. 7. The number landed heavier than it should have. Clifford glanced at the bakery window beside them, catching their reflections in the glass. He looked like what he was: tailored coat, clean shoes, sharp lines. She looked like someone who had walked too far on tired legs. "Why didn't you run?" he asked quietly. Sonia frowned, confused by the question. Run where? Most adults had an answer for that. Home, safety, someone else's problem. Sonia had none of those. "You're scary, honestly," then swallowed. "But you're the only one people listen to." That was when Clifford understood. She hadn't chosen him because she trusted him. She'd chosen him because she believed in his power. A passerby slowed, curiosity flickering, then thought better of it and moved on. Mrs. Alvarez watched from the corner shop, hands clasped tight against her apron, eyes full of questions she didn't dare ask. Sonia's gaze dropped to the ground for a moment. When she looked back up, her eyes were wet but steady. "I didn't know who else could help," she said. Something tightened behind Clifford's ribs. He'd built his life making sure people feared him enough to not ask for anything personal. And yet here she was, standing in front of him, refusing to disappear. He straightened slightly, giving her space, giving her dignity. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said, surprising himself with the words. Sonia let out a shaky breath she'd been holding far too long. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe she might not be alone anymore. Sonia tightened her grip on the crumpled bill, as if it might vanish if she loosened her fingers. The noise of the street faded around them, cars passing, doors opening, footsteps echoing, but her world narrowed to the man crouched in front of her. "I tried the police," she said suddenly. Clifford's eyes sharpened. He didn't interrupt. He'd learned long ago that silence made people tell the truth faster than pressure ever could. "They asked me questions I didn't know how to answer," she continued, her words tumbling over each other now that they'd started. "They wanted names, addresses. I don't know those things." She shook her head hard. "They said they'd look into it, but they didn't come. They didn't call." Her voice cracked on the last word. Clifford glanced briefly at Ethan, who gave the smallest nod. No report, no alert, nothing that had reached their ears. That alone was wrong. Sonia took a half-step closer, lowering her voice as if the street itself might be listening. "The men who took my mom said if I talked to anyone else, she wouldn't come home." She lifted her sleeve without being asked. A faint yellow bruise bloomed against her skin, old but not healed. "They wanted me to remember." The air changed. Even Victor shifted his weight, jaw tightening.
Clifford felt something cold and precise settle in his chest. Not rage yet, but the calculation that always came before it. "Did they tell you where they were taking her?" Sonia nodded quickly. "A place near the river, with loud doors." She squeezed her eyes shut, searching her memory. It smelled bad, like oil. A warehouse, Clifford thought, or a dockside storage yard. Too many possibilities, too familiar. "Why come to me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She hesitated, then said, "Because they said you own the streets." Her gaze met his, unwavering. "And because bad men are scared of you." The honesty of it landed harder than any accusation. He had spent years cultivating that reputation, wearing it like armor. He had never imagined a child would use it as a lifeline. Sonia extended the $5 again, her arm shaking now from exhaustion rather than fear. "I don't have more, but I can wait. I can do chores. I just need my mom." Clifford closed his fingers gently around the bill, not to accept payment, but to stop her from offering it again. "The police won't help you," he said quietly. Her shoulders sagged, confirmation hurting more than the words. "But I will," he added. Sonia's breath hitched, hope breaking through disbelief like light through cracked glass. And in that moment, Clifford Morrison crossed a line he'd sworn never to touch, choosing a child's trust over the rules that had kept him alive.
Clifford Morrison had survived because he lived by rules. Not suggestions, not morals. Rules carved into him by blood and consequence. No deals made in the open, no mercy mistaken for weakness, and above all, children were never part of the business. They were lines you did not cross, names you did not speak, shadows you stepped around and left untouched. Men who ignored that rule never lasted long in his world. He straightened slowly, the $5 folded between his fingers like a reminder he didn't want but couldn't discard. Sonia watched him carefully now, as if afraid the wrong movement might undo what he'd just promised. "Wait here," he said, his voice steady. She nodded at once, obeying without question. That trust cut deeper than defiance ever could. Clifford turned away from her and walked a few steps toward his men. The street noise rushed back in, but inside him, everything went quiet. Ethan leaned in first, lowering his voice. "Boss, this is dangerous. If word gets out—" "I know," Clifford said. Victor's tone was cooler, sharper. "If someone is operating inside our territory without permission, that's a problem. But involving a child makes this messy." Messy was another word for lethal. Clifford's gaze drifted past them to the girl standing alone on the sidewalk, shoulders squared like she was bracing against a storm. He remembered another night, years ago, when he'd learned these rules the hard way, when hesitation had cost him someone he could never bring back. The memory stayed buried, but not gone. "The rules kept me alive," he said quietly. "They also turned me into something people cross the street to avoid." Ethan followed his line of sight. "So what now?" he asked. Clifford closed his hand around the folded bill, feeling its thin edges bite into his palm. "Now we find out who thought it was acceptable to take a mother from her child." Victor's eyes narrowed, interest sharpening into purpose. "And if it's one of ours?" Victor asked. "Then the rules apply," Clifford replied. His voice dropped, cold and final. "No exceptions." He turned back toward Sonia, her chin lifted when she saw him coming, as if she'd been holding herself upright by sheer will alone. "I have rules," he told her, crouching again so they were eye level. "They're the reason I'm still standing." She nodded slowly. "My mom has rules too, like always walking me to school." The simplicity of it hit him harder than any threat ever had. Clifford inhaled once, deep and controlled. "Those men broke my rules, and yours."
Sonia's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, believing him with the kind of faith that couldn't be bought or forced. As he stood, Clifford realized the truth he'd been avoiding. The rules that have kept him alive were about to be tested, not by an enemy, but by a child who had nothing left to lose.
Clifford didn't need much to start seeing patterns. The city spoke to him in fragments, missed calls, quiet corners, trucks that moved only at night. He listened now with a sharper ear, the image of Sonia standing alone on the sidewalk anchoring every thought. He sent Ethan ahead, not with orders shouted or threats made, but with questions placed in the right mouths. Dock workers who owed favors, security guards who'd learned when not to look too closely. Within an hour, whispers began to surface. Men working out of the old industrial strip near the river, no signage, no regular schedule, too many deliveries for a place that wasn't supposed to be active. Clifford stood in the back seat of his car, city lights streaking past the tinted windows. He imagined the place Sonia described, the smell of oil, the clang of metal doors. It fit too well. "They keep to the shadows," Victor said from the passenger seat, scanning the messages coming in. "No names, no affiliations. They move people fast, keep 'em quiet." "Not quiet enough," Clifford replied. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the glass. The calm mask was back in place, but something beneath it had shifted. This wasn't a turf dispute or a business correction. This was rot. Ethan's phone buzzed. He listened, then glanced back. One of the men was seen grabbing a woman near a bus stop 2 nights ago. Dark jacket, foreign accent. Witnesses kept walking. Sonia's words echoed in Clifford's mind. "Bad men are scared of you," he said. "They should be." They drove past the river without slowing, taking the long way around. Clifford didn't rush into darkness without knowing where it ended. The men in the shadows thrived on fear and silence. He had built his empire by breaking both. "Whoever they are," Victor said, "they're careful. They don't touch kids, they use them." That earned him a sharp look. "They leave the children behind," Victor clarified. "Leverage." Clifford closed his eyes briefly. A mother taken, a child left to choose between obedience and hope. The calculation was deliberate, cruel. "Find out who's protecting them," Clifford said. "No operation survives this long without help." Ethan nodded. "And if they don't have protection?" Clifford replied. "Then they're reckless, which makes them dangerous." The car slowed near the industrial district, lights flickering in a few windows, just enough to suggest life without inviting attention. Clifford felt it then, the unmistakable sense of trespass. Someone had been operating where they didn't belong, believing the darkness would hide them. It wouldn't. As they turned away, Clifford's phone vibrated with a final message. One word stood out: Mother. The men in the shadows thought they were invisible. They had no idea they'd already stepped into the light, and that Clifford Morrison was coming for them.
Sonia sat on the steps outside Mrs. Alvarez's shop, her feet barely touching the ground. Mrs. Alvarez had given her a warm drink and a seat near the window, but Sonia's eyes never left the street. Every passing car made her sit up straighter, hope rising and falling in quick, painful waves. Clifford returned just as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the pavement. When Sonia saw him, she stood so quickly the cup slipped from her hands and spilled onto the ground. "You came back," she said, as if she hadn't fully believed he would. "I said I would," Clifford replied. He crouched in front of her again, the same way he had before, but this time the space between them felt different. Not lighter, just decided. "I need you to tell me everything you remember," he said, "even the small things, especially the small things." She nodded and began listing details the way children do, without knowing which ones matter. A red mark on a man's neck, a van that rattled when it turned, a song playing softly somewhere inside the building. Clifford listened to it all, storing each fragment like a piece of a larger map. When she finished, her voice dropped. "Do I have to give you more money?" The question landed like a quiet blow. Clifford reached into his coat and unfolded the $5 bill. It was creased, worn thin, the corners soft from being held too long. He placed it gently back into her palm. "This isn't payment," he said. "It's a promise." She stared at the bill, confused. "You trusted me with the only thing you had," he continued. "That makes this deal worth more than money." Sonia's fingers closed around it slowly, as if afraid it might disappear again. "Does that mean you'll really help?" "It means I already am." Mrs. Alvarez watched from the doorway, eyes shining, hands pressed to her chest as if she were witnessing something sacred. She said nothing. Some moments didn't need witnesses. Clifford stood and adjusted his coat, the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. Business would be handled the way it always was, quietly, efficiently, without mercy. But this time, the reason was different. "I'm gonna find your mom," he said. Sonia's lip trembled, but she held herself together. "Can I see her again?" "Yes." "When?" "Soon." She nodded, accepting the answer because it was all she could do. Children learned early that promises were fragile things. Still, she believed him. As Clifford turned to leave, Sonia called out, "Mister?" He paused. "Thank you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. He couldn't trust his voice to stay steady. As he walked back toward the car, the $5 no longer in his hand, Clifford realized the truth. He hadn't taken on a job. He'd accepted responsibility, and that kind of deal could never be undone.
The call went out without raised voices or hurried words. Clifford didn't need urgency to be understood. When he summoned his crew like this, it meant the night would not end quietly. Ethan arrived first, jacket already off, sleeves rolled as if his body had prepared before his mind caught up. Victor followed minutes later, tablet in hand, eyes sharp with focus. Others joined in silence, men who had learned when questions were unnecessary. Clifford stood at the head of the room, city lights spilling through the high windows behind him. The calm on his face was the same one they'd seen before raids, before disappearances, before problems that needed erasing. "There's an operation near the river," he said, "unauthorized, taking people." That was enough to stiffen every spine in the room. "They crossed a line," he continued. "They took a mother, left her child behind." A murmur moved through the crew, low and dangerous. This wasn't business, this was provocation. Victor tapped the screen and projected a map onto the wall. "Warehouse cluster, east side, limited security, irregular transport schedule. They're careful, but not careful enough." Ethan cracked his knuckles once, then stillness. "Rules?" Clifford met his gaze. Clean, fast, no witnesses left inside that place. "And the victims?" someone asked from the back. "Protected," Clifford said without hesitation. "Every one of them." Silence followed. Not doubt, but respect. This wasn't the directive they were used to. It was better. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking weapons, syncing earpieces, confirming routes. No bravado, no wasted motion. The kind of preparation that came from men who understood consequence. As the room emptied, Victor lingered. "This changes things," he said quietly. Clifford nodded. "It already has." He thought of Sonia sitting on those steps, clutching a piece of paper that meant more to her than his entire empire. He thought of the men in the shadows who believed fear would keep them safe. "Tonight," Clifford said, "we remind them who owns this city." The engines started one by one, low and steady, like a pulse awakening beneath the streets. As they pulled away, Clifford allowed himself one final thought, not of violence, not of control, but of a promise made on a sidewalk. By the time the night was over, that promise would be kept, and anyone who stood in the way would learn what it cost to mistake kindness for weakness. The warehouse squatted by the river like it had something to hide. Rust crawled along its metal skin, and only one light burned near the side entrance, flickering just enough to suggest activity without inviting attention. The smell of oil hung thick in the air, exactly as Sonia had said.
Clifford watched from the car as the crew spread out, shadows moving with purpose. No alarms sounded, no guards shouted. Whoever ran this place relied more on secrecy than strength. They slipped inside through a service door, hinges whining softly before going still. The air was colder within, heavy with damp concrete and fear. The first thing Clifford noticed wasn't the machinery or the stacked crates, it was the silence. Not empty, but forced, the kind that pressed down on your ears. A muffled sound drifted from deeper inside, not voices, breathing. Ethan signaled left, Victor went right. Clifford moved straight ahead, every step measured. His heart beat slow and controlled, but something tight coiled in his chest. They found the first group behind a chain-link barrier. Women, tired eyes, bruised wrists. One of them clutched a scrap of fabric like it was the last thing anchoring her to the world. When they saw Clifford, panic flashed, then hope, sharp and dangerous. "You're safe," Clifford said quietly. "No one here will hurt you again." The words felt heavier than any command he'd ever given. Further inside, a door slammed, footsteps, voices rising in alarm. The shadows scattered. Clifford pushed forward, following the noise. A man lunged from behind a crate, knife flashing. Ethan intercepted him in a single, brutal motion, dropping him without a sound. Another tried to run. Victor blocked the exit, expression cold as the river outside. In a back room, they found her. She was seated on the floor, wrists bound, hair disheveled, but eyes still burning with defiance. When she looked up, something in her face broke open. "My daughter, is she—" "She's waiting for you," Clifford said quietly. Tears spilled down her cheeks as her body sagged in relief. Clifford cut the restraints himself, hands steady, careful. For a moment, the room felt smaller, crowded with everything unsaid. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not police, but the alarms of a system collapsing under its own lies. The men who had run this place were gone or broken, their power stripped in minutes. As they escorted the victims out into the night air, the river reflected the lights like nothing had happened. But inside the warehouse, everything had changed. Clifford took one last look back before leaving. The shadows no longer belonged to the men who had hidden there. They belonged to him now, and he was done letting monsters live in them. The last man tried to bargain. He backed toward the far wall of the warehouse, hands raised, eyes darting between Clifford and the exit that no longer existed. His voice shook as he spoke, words tumbling out in a language that had saved him before. "We can talk," he said. "You don't understand. This wasn't personal, just business." Clifford stopped a few feet away. The noise of the river seeped through the cracked walls, steady and indifferent. He had heard those words in many forms over the years. They had never meant less. "You took a mother," Clifford said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You used her child to keep her silent." The man swallowed hard. "That's how it works. People pay. People disappear." Clifford's gaze didn't waver. Not here. Ethan stood behind him, silent as stone. Victor blocked the last corridor, arms crossed, already knowing how this would end. The man's bravado cracked completely. "I didn't touch the kid, I swear. I have rules too." Clifford stepped closer, close enough that the man could see his reflection in Clifford's eyes. "Then you should have known better." There was a line in this city, one even criminals whispered about, a boundary that once crossed erased whatever protection a man thought he had. Clifford hadn't drawn that line for appearances, he'd drawn it because someone once crossed it against him. "This ends tonight," Clifford said. The man tried to run. He didn't get far. When it was over, the warehouse was silent again, not the forced silence from before, but the kind that followed resolution. Ethan exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders. Victor checked his watch, already moving to the next necessary step: cleanup, containment, erasure. Clifford stood alone for a moment, staring at the empty space where the man had been. Power had always come easily to him. Justice had not. He wasn't sure what this was, but it felt closer to right than anything he'd done in years. Outside, the night air felt cleaner. The victims were already being escorted to safety, given coats, water, names to call. A network had been dismantled, not for profit or control, but because someone had finally said enough. Clifford looked toward the city skyline, lights blinking like distant witnesses. He knew stories would spread, as they always did, but this one would be different. A line had been crossed, and then erased. No one would make that mistake again. The last man didn't scream. He begged. He stumbled backward, palms raised, eyes darting wildly between Clifford and the men sealing off every escape. His confidence had drained away, leaving only panic and the desperate instinct to survive. "Wait, listen," he said, voice cracking. "This doesn't have to end this way. We can make a deal." Clifford stepped forward, the echo of his shoes loud in the empty space. The warehouse lights buzzed faintly overhead. Somewhere outside, the river moved on, uncaring. "You already made your deal," Clifford said evenly. "You just didn't think I'd hear about it." The man swallowed. "I never touched the kid, I swear. I only followed orders." Clifford's gaze hardened. "You followed the wrong ones." Ethan stood off to the side, arms crossed, saying nothing. Victor had positioned himself near the exit, ensuring there would be no mistakes, no loose ends. Everyone in the room understood what this moment meant. "There's a line in this city," Clifford continued, his voice calm but final. "You don't hurt families. You don't use children as leverage. That line is why some of us still breathe." The man shook his head violently. "I didn't know." "You knew enough," Clifford cut in. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the man turned and ran. He made it 3 steps. When it was over, the warehouse felt different. The fear that had clung to its walls like dampness was gone, replaced by a heavy, settling quiet. Not peace, closure. Clifford looked down at the space where the man had fallen. He felt no triumph, only certainty. Outside, the victims were being guided into waiting vehicles, wrapped in coats, offered water, and quiet reassurance. Lives that had been paused were moving again. Victor checked his phone, already coordinating the aftermath. "It's done." Clifford nodded once. As they stepped into the night, the city lights reflected off the river like broken stars. Somewhere across town, a little girl was waiting, counting minutes instead of coins. Clifford adjusted his coat and walked toward the car, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in years. The line had been crossed, and tonight it had ended everything. Dawn was just beginning to soften the edges of the city when Clifford's car pulled back onto the familiar street. The night had stripped the darkness from him, leaving something quieter in its place, something heavier. Sonia was still awake. She sat on the same steps where he'd left her, knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the road as if she'd willed the hours to slow. Mrs. Alvarez stood nearby, a blanket draped around the girl's shoulders, relief flickering across her face when the car stopped. Sonia was on her feet before the door fully opened. Clifford stepped out, and behind him another car pulled in. The door opened slowly. A woman emerged. Tired, bruised, but standing. When her eyes found Sonia, everything else disappeared. "Mom!" The word tore out of Sonia as she ran, small legs moving faster than they ever had. Her mother dropped to her knees just in time to catch her, arms wrapping tight, as if letting go would undo the miracle. They clung to each other, both crying now, the kind of sobs that came from being pulled back from the edge. Clifford watched from a distance. He didn't intrude. Some moments were not his to touch. After a while, Sonia pulled back and looked at her mother's face, touching it gently, checking that it was real. Then she turned and ran back toward Clifford, stopping just in front of him. He knelt, meeting her at eye level, and held out his hand. The $5 bill rested in his palm, smoothed now, no longer folded tight. "You forgot this," he said. Sonia stared at it, then shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "That was for helping." He smiled, just slightly. "And you helped me," he replied. "So we're even." He placed the bill into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep it," he added, "for school, or ice cream, something good." She nodded solemnly, then surprised him by stepping forward and hugging him. It was brief and awkward, her arms barely reaching around his coat, but it hit harder than anything that had happened that night. "Thank you," she whispered. Clifford didn't move until she stepped back. When he stood, he felt different, unchained in a way he hadn't known he was bound. As the sun rose higher, mother and daughter walked away together, hand in hand, disappearing into a future that had almost been taken from them. Clifford turned toward his car. The city was waking up, unaware of what had been erased in the night. But somewhere deep inside him, something had begun again, and it all started with $5.